So I came across this tweet today from quote unquote maximum atheist. First, a comment on the handle. If you describe yourself as a maximum anything, that's going to tend to convey fanaticism to people outside of your community. So when I read somebody describing themselves as a maximum Catholic or a maximum Calvinist or a maximum atheist, then that's kind of suggesting some degree of fanaticism on the part of that person. It's a red flag. So just a caution for maximum atheists and how they're presenting to others. But now maximum atheist tweets a meme, and the meme says something, names something Christians say when they know they are losing an argument with an atheist. And the maximum atheist gives an example. Their answer is prove that God doesn't exist. So the idea here being that when a Christian, when you provide counter evidence to their view that they can't respond to, they will say, well, you can't prove God doesn't exist. And I agree with maximum atheist uh, in the implication here that that's not a good rebuttal. It's not a good retort. It's not a good response. Really, it's a deflection because the fact that you can't prove something doesn't exist doesn't thereby give you a good ground to believe it does exist. So just because you can't prove something is false doesn't give you a good reason to believe it is true. So, insofar as that's what the Christian is doing here, they're simply deflecting from counter evidence by presenting an unreasonable, indefensible standard of belief. And it's right to call them out on that. Now, the thing is, however, that given this individual refers to themselves as a maximum atheist, I'm guessing they don't have the same standard of internal critique for atheists that they apply to Christians, which is what you would tend to expect with a fanatic. Someone who describes themselves as a maximum X is that they're not going to have the same internal self critique on their own position. So I thought I would help out by posting my own comment. So I said the atheist equivalent of this is I don't believe God doesn't exist. I'm just without belief in God. The point here being that sometimes a person will describe themselves as an atheist, which, in terms of the standard traditional definition going back centuries, was a positive claim about the nature of reality. And that claim was that there is no such being as God who exists. That's what that person was saying. So it is a denial of the existence of God, a belief that God does not exist. But sometimes when you offer people who have described themselves as atheists evidence that God does exist, they will then, instead of responding to that evidence, they will redefine their belief by saying, it's not that I believe God doesn't exist, it's that I'm without belief that God does exist, which is really a way of moving the claim of atheism into something that is closer to what we would historically call agnosticism, being without belief in God's existence or non-existence. So this person has gone from a position of saying there is no such person as God, or I do not believe there's such a person as God, to saying I do not believe or disbelieve that there's such a person as God, which is again agnosticism. Now they may then say, well, okay, that's soft atheism or weak atheism, and here we're just into uh, kind of semantic games, I would say, because fine, you can call yourself a weak or soft atheist, but really what you've done is stepped outside of making any truth claim at all. So you're just not part of the conversation anymore. So that was my point. So this was a critique of atheists, just as I accepted maximum atheist critique of Christians. Maximum atheist then responded to my tweet by saying, well, prove it does. I'll wait. And I was thinking, prove what does? And then I guess what maximum atheist was saying here is that I should prove God does exist. But of course, that's um, an odd claim. I've never claimed to be able to prove God exists, nor would I claim that one is rationally compelled to be able to prove God does exist. Just like uh, the inability to prove something exists is not a ground to believe it does exist. So the ability to prove something exists is not a necessary ground to believe it does exist. Those are just two equal and opposite errors. So it was kind of ironic that a maximum atheist was critiquing the atheist version of that error by essentially flipping around to their own error by thinking you have to be able to prove God does exist to believe God does exist. Now, with that said, I want to take a step back and just offer some further comments about proof and God and atheism. Well, let's think about God here as a philosophical concept, where God is the idea of an impersonal, metaphysically necessary being with certain perfections. And the question is, what grounds are there philosophically to believe in the existence of such a being? Now, if we want to talk, first of all, about proof as the standard, well, then you have to define what you mean by proof. And if we mean by proof mathematical proof, then what you're saying is in order to believe God exists, you'd have to have an argument that is logically valid with premises that can only be denied on pain of irrationality. So the premises are themselves compelling. You cannot deny them and be rational. And then the conclusion of God's existence just follows from those premises. And so that would be the highest sort of standard of proof for the existence of God. And again, there's no proof, I believe, that God exists like that. Of course, the ontological argument sought to provide such a proof. And I don't think the ontological argument succeeds in that ground. At most, what it succeeds in doing is saying that if God exists, God must exist. But if it's possible that God exists, then God must exist. But that sort of raises the question, okay, then is it possible that God does exist? Because we have different intuitions. Some intuitions support the possibility that God does exist. Some intuitions support the possibility that God does not exist. And in each way, if you follow through those intuitions, it would lead to the conclusion either God necessarily does exist or God necessarily does not exist. So you don't have a proof in the sense of compelling every rational person. A lower standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's not like a mathematical certainty, as it were, but it's a logical certainty. But it is nonetheless compelling for any rational person. And that's the kind of standard that you would get in a criminal court proceeding, for example. In that case, it's certainly possible that, if you convict Smith of murder, it's still possible that further evidence may exonerate Smith. And so that's a lower standard of proof. Still, I don't think there's any standard of proof for God's existence that meets that bar. So then you're into, well, is there proof by preponderance of the evidence or clear and compelling evidence, which are two lower standards of proof yet? And I'll just say that, well, people disagree on that, on whether there's proof to that level. But is that an issue for God's existence and belief in God as a philosophical postulate? And here I would say, well, just follow that through for every other truth claim that is debated in philosophy. Find for me a truth claim debated in philosophy, and particularly, let's say, truth claims that posit metaphysical entities. Give me one that meets mathematical certainty or beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, there's not many, right? Or are there? Do you have Lewis's possible world? Is there an argument for that is meets a standard of proof? An argument for Platonic universals that meets a standard of proof? An argument for the existence of souls that meets the standard of proof? An argument that nature is absolute that meets that standard of proof? I don't think in any of these cases you meet that standard of proof, whether it's mathematical certainty or beyond a reasonable doubt. So the fact that it doesn't apply to God is neither here nor there. God is a perfectly respectable philosophical hypothesis, even though it does not compel belief among people who rationally consider the evidence for that hypothesis.